There we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, we're back in class again, thank God. We make sure we give a little bit of charity into the tzedakah box. Again, always do this before you study. Gives you some charity to give throughout the week or throughout the month whenever you empty your box. And also make sure that the angels of charity bless our study. Okay, so we're going to go through a lot tonight. A lot, I hope, including starting to introduce one of the most important and one of my favorite topics in Judaism, the idea of Talmud. But let's start off a little earlier than that, a little bit before that. Because I realize there are some people taking this class who have no idea about some rituals in Judaism, as well as many people who are Jewish and have been living it for a lot of years, don't necessarily know things. So I want to talk about two specific ritual items. The first is called a Talit. This is a Talit, otherwise known as a Talis or prayer shawl. This is a smaller one. What makes a Talit as opposed to just a blanket is on the four corners, it has these tzitzit. Tzitzit is the word for knots. And if you can see that, these are on the four corners of each. There are four spaces, one for each of the letters of God's name and of the four worlds. And we say a blessing and we put it on when we say certain prayers. We typically do not put it on in the evening, although there's some exceptions. And we certainly wear it whenever we are reading Torah. We also do it on our morning blessings, and it's one of the rituals. The idea is that the talis is an unfinished fabric, something that is always growing like our soul. And it is the sign we give it to someone when they become a bar or bat mitzvah, like we had this past weekend or this coming weekend. It is the sign of an adult. And I understand in Judaism, an adult, once you become an adult, 13 years old, you're allowed to read the Torah publicly, but that's not even the most important part of what a bar or bat mitzvah is. The most important part is you're considered an adult in the Jewish community. That means you have the same voting rights and privileges as any other adult. You have the right to lead services. You have the right to give commentary on the Torah portion of the week or to teach. And since you have that right once you're 13, we want to make sure that you do it as soon as you can after that. But whether you have the ceremony or you don't have the ceremony, you're still a bar mitzvah, you're still a bat mitzvah. It means son or daughter of a commandment. It's kind of like at 16 or at 18, you can vote, but you may not vote, but you still are a citizen and you still have that privilege. So that's what a bar or bat mitzvah is. And it's not even the reading of the Torah that is so important. It's a commentary. We believe at the age of 13, a young adult has the knowledge and wisdom, the life experience to be able to explore and to teach and expound upon the words of Torah. If you did not have that ritual at some point when you were younger, for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter whether it's because you converted to Judaism, whether it's because you grew up in a world where that didn't happen for whatever reason, we put together every year an adult B'nai Mitzvah class. I believe we're doing it again shortly. That'll be started. And I think they're looking at about 9 months to a year of study. So again, something to think about. That's one of our ritual objects. The other ritual object that we really need to talk about is something called tefillin, or tefillin. In English, the word is phylacteries. This comes from the biblical commandment where it says you will have fringes on your garment, and they will stop your eyes, which used to go looking in the wrong way. And it also says in the Ve'ahavta, in one of our prayers, it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall speak of them when you lie down, when you rise up, all these different things. Then it says, you shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be for frontlets between thine eyes. That's what tefillin are. So there are two tefillin that we use, okay? The first is the one that goes around our arm. And we're going to give a class, sometime in the next month on tefillin. And this goes around the arm, is wrapped in a very specific way, which we'll go over through class. This is not my tefillin, so forgive me. This way then. So it goes around the arm and the hand in a very specific way. And then you have this other tefillin, the tefillin shel rosh, the tefillin of the head. Inside these little boxes, written by a scribe, the same kind of man who writes a Torah, are the commandments. And again, this is not. Actually, these are two hand ones. The other one, these are my film. These are actually some of the temples. The other one goes on our head like this and is bound around the head. And the idea is that when you have these on, you have your talis on as well. We do this during the morning prayers every morning. And it's a reminder that we are the instrument of God, that we should always be thinking and acting in such a way that brings life, God, our teachings, our tradition, honor, and teaching. So again, this is something only done by adults. Children are not allowed to do this. And I need to separate all the tefillin before we actually do this. So we have them for the class we're going to give, I think, in a couple of weeks. So those are tefillin and talit. You'll hear a talit called a talit or a talis. Both are correct. In Hebrew, the letter tov can be pronounced depending on where it is in the word, tov or sof, and depending on where you're from. So a talit or talis is the same thing. It's the prayer shawl. All right, let's go into some more information and some understanding. It has been said, and there's a truth to it, that if you understand the prayer book and you understand the calendar, you understand all of Judaism. I don't know that it's totally true, but it's certainly a good insight. And so I want to go through very briefly and very quickly our calendar so you can see how our holidays keep us alive. You know, we say more than the Shabbat, the Sabbath, has kept more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. So every week we have Shabbat. Okay, it's every week from Friday night to Saturday night till the 3 stars in the air or in the sky. Shabbat is a day of rest. As my friend Rabbi Arthur Gross Schaefer likes to say, it's a day when God gives you a note, says, thank you for all the work you've done this week, but this one day I can rule the world without your help. It begins at sunset like all Jewish holidays do. And the reason is because you may remember when we studied a few weeks back, we studied the beginning lines of the book of Genesis, when God creates the universe, it says on the first day, and there was evening and there was morning, day 1. So for us, the 24-hour cycle actually begins at sunset. That's why Jewish holidays always begin the night before. And so you've got to make sure your calendar, when you're looking at what date in English the Hebrew calendar is, you need to make sure you're aligned properly. But we're going to go very quickly through the different holidays. You'll see a list of them up here. And we're going to start with Rosh Hashanah that we just had. Rosh Hashanah meaning the head of the year. And by the way, the best book, in my opinion, the best book to understand the holidays and the calendar is this book by Rabbi Greenberg. It's called The Jewish Way. And the subtitle is Living the Holidays. Spectacular book to understand what the holidays are about. I recommend it in every Jewish library. Every Jewish home should have this. So you can look and kind of see what is the history, what are some of the practices around the holiday. But as we go right through the calendar, we start with Rosh Hashanah. This is Jewish New Year. It's the opening of our book of life. It is the beginning of the year. It's on the first day of the month of Tishrei. That's the name of the Hebrew month. We don't name our months January, February, March, etc. We name them Elul, Tishrei, etc. Hold on a second. I just want to double check. Okay. So sorry, there was about a bar mitzvah later on this week. So Rosh Hashanah begins on the first day of Tishrei. It's not the party like we think of the secular New Year. It's more of a pensive time, a thoughtful time. We open our book of life and take a real look at how do we live this past year and how do we want to live the coming year. We start a process of tshuva, which means redemption, reconciliation, or return, where we start to make amends with the people that we've hurt this past year. We take a real inventory called cheshbon hanefesh. We take a real inventory of our life and how we've been living, and we apologize. And it's not just apologizing. Tshuva, this concept of tshuva is not just, I'm sorry, I broke your window. There's a number of steps to it. The first thing is to recognize you did something wrong, whether it was on purpose or by accident. Let's say, God forbid, I broke someone's window. My first thing is to take responsibility and say, hi, I'm sorry I broke your window. The second step is to actually repair the window. In our tradition, just saying I'm sorry doesn't cut it. You need to fix it. Then you need to make a commitment not to do it again, the same way at least. So if I broke your window because I was throwing a baseball, my elbow was too low, I may break it again because my elbow is too high, but I'm not going to break it the same way at the same time. So you make a commitment not to break it, not to do the same mistake. And then when the opportunity arises, you don't do the mistake. You don't make that chait, that error. This process really gets intense for Rosh Hashanah and the next 10 days, culminating in Yom Kippur, meaning the day of at-one-ment, or the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur is the day, the idea is the 9 days beforehand, we've really tried to work it out with all the people for the past year in our life. And this 10th day, Yom Kippur, is just between us and God. What are the mistakes I've made regarding with God, regarding with life, regarding myself? Where have I not given to myself where I should? Where have I not given my gifts, or where have I hurt people? Where have I done things that aren't right? And so Yom Kippur is the day we want to let go of our physical world, let go of our physical body, and totally be in a spiritual space. In order to help that, we have practices. We fast, no food, no water. We don't wear leather. We don't brush our teeth. I hate that one. We don't shower. There's no intimate relations. All these different things to keep us in a space that we're transcending our physical body. It's not a fast for penance. That's really important. It's a fast to become spiritual. In fact, there's a common mistake that Yom Kippur is a sad day. And there are very few things that the rabbis of the last few thousand years agree on. But one of them is that Yom Kippur is one of the two happiest days of the year. The other one being Tu B'Av. But that this is a day when God has said, if you come with an open heart, if you ask for forgiveness, God has said, I am forced to forgive you. Not for the sins you've done against other people, but for the sins you've done against yourself, against God. So we have Yom Kippur. A few days go by, and then we have this holiday called Sukkot. Sukkot meaning booths. We build a temporary structure. Many of you have come to my home where we have the community sukkah. This year was a little bit different, but typically we have programming every night with as many as 100, 120 people here. Every night we have different programming. The idea is you're supposed to dwell in your sukkah. So it's very holy. It's a temporary structure, temporary booth. The community puts it together, and you have dinners in it, and you study in it, and you have services in it, and you have classes in it. The first class in this series was done in our community sukkah, if you go back to that first class about a month ago. So we have Sukkot. That ends after the week, and it ends with something called Shmini Atzeret. Shmini Atzeret is a holiday where we pray for rain. We don't pray for rain before Sukkot. Again, Sukkot or Sukkot. We don't pray for rain then, because Sukkot's a temporary structure. The top is covered with palm fronds, and it's to be kosher, it has to be there have to be enough palm fronds so that there's more shade than sun in the midday, but so you can see the stars at nighttime. You don't want it raining while you're in the sukkah, so we don't start our prayers for rain until Shmini Atzeret, at the end of Sukkot. And the next day we have something called Sunclass Torah, where we read the last paragraph of the Torah, and then the first, and we start the cycle all over again for the year's reading of the Torah. The Torah is divided into Torah portions, which we read each week, and a little bit of reading every week. As one person once said, it's the world's longest mantra. It takes a whole year to go through. So we end it and begin it on Simchat Torah. Then we get a month off. We get a little bit of time off. And then we have the next holiday called Hanukkah. Hanukkah is both about the defeat of by the Hashmoneans, who took back over the Maccabees, who took back over Israel and rededicated the temple, and had one cask of oil, and it lasted for 8 days, and there was enough oil for one day. It's both about that miracle, Shas Anisim Lavotenu, miracles that were done for us, for our ancestors, and it's also about the biblical commandment that we should remember Jacob, our father, patriarch Jacob. We should remember the anniversary of his death for the week, as is ordained by Joseph, his son, in chapter 50 of the book of Genesis. So it has a double meaning. It's both two holidays combined into one: the biblical remembrance of Jacob and the miracle of the war miracle, really, the military victory of the Hashmoneans, of the Maccabees, against the Seleucids, against the Greeks. We wait a little bit longer. With the next holiday, the holiday we have is typically in January, February, and it's called Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is the New Year of the Trees. In the Talmud, we're going to talk about that tonight, it says that there are 4 New Years, one of which is Rosh Hashanah, but it says one of them is the New Year of the Trees on the 15th day of the month of Shvat. And this is where it's the first ecological holiday. It's where we really take a look at the gifts of trees. We have a Seder, just like a Passover Seder, only there are 4 different types of fruits or nuts, 4 different glasses of wine, one that is all white, one that's white with a little red, one that's red with a little white, one that's all red. And it's a very mystical holiday. It's really been embraced by our Kabbalim, our sages who were into the mystical part of our tradition. A month after that, we have this holiday called Purim. This is based on the biblical book of Esther, and we have that book as well, and we have that entire story. which reminds me I need to do something right there. Okay. So we have this book of Esther, and it's all based on that. We then have, after Purim, we have Pesach. Pesach is the holiday where we commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, and most of us have experienced a Passover Seder. It's the most practiced holiday or ritual in Judaism. And we have the Seder, meaning an order of meals that we eat. After Passover, we have this thing called the counting of the Omer. It's the time period between Passover and Shavuot. Passover is when we leave Egypt. Shavuot is when we're given the 10 Commandments in Mount Sinai. And during those 50 days, we have a couple of holidays. The whole period is called the counting of the Omer. It's a meditative period. It's also the 33rd day of it, Lag BaOmer, is a big celebration for a number of different reasons, including that was when Shimon Bar Yochai, the author of the Holy Zohar, one of the texts of Jewish mysticism, died. That's this amazing holiday. It's when we get haircuts often. Later on, during this counting of the Omer period, we have Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut, the days of remembering the Holocaust and Israeli independence, remembering Israel. And then it culminates with Shavuot, which is generally in May, June, somewhere in there. And that we study all night. We spend the whole night studying. And after that, we have dairy desserts and things like that. It's a beautiful, beautiful holiday. Shavuot is so spectacular, most people do not even realize it, because it's not something that is as popular as Sukkot or Passover. It's really a wonderful, wonderful holiday. After Shavuot, we will have a holiday called Tisha B'Av. Generally, this is July, August, sometime in that time. This is the holiday. It's kind of like Friday the 13th. Everything bad that ever happened in Judaism happened on Tisha B'Av, pretty much, the 9th day of the month of Av, and we commemorate that, including the destruction of the temple and things like that. And then that takes us right after Tisha B'Av into a month called Elul, which is the month where we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, and we're back at Rosh Hashanah. So that's our calendar, so to speak. I want to talk about one other thing before we get into Talmud. Lana, would you pass me that Tanakh, please? Thank you. You may remember last week, because we haven't finished the whole Bible. We need to do that. You may remember that last week, I said that 2/3 of this book is either written by King David, written by King Solomon, or is about the temple. And we studied the Torah and we studied the prophets. I wanted to spend a little bit of time studying what are called Ketuvim. That's the last portion of the Hebrew scriptures. It means writings. It's the sacred writings. And I teach this very differently, and I know that, and pretty much anyone else does. I actually wrote a book, a biblical commentary on it called Sacred Relationships. I was very blessed. It was endorsed by everyone from the Chancellor of Oxford to Oprah's guru to rabbis, ministers, and the Vatican. So, and Zalman Schachter Shalomi, all sorts of people. And it's a commentary just on Ketuvim. So let's talk about Ketuvim for a moment, this third section of the Bible. These are all the writings. When you think of poetic writings like Psalms, or Proverbs, or Song of Songs. So let's just go through them very briefly. The nature of this book, and I will tell you why I teach it differently. It is typically looked at 3 books of poetry, 5 books that are associated with different holidays, and then other writings. It says in the Talmud that there's a thread that ties them together. Years ago when I was teaching at Loyola, I found a thread. I don't know if it's the same thread, but I did find a thread that ties them together. I then tested that teaching students based on this concept, and they could look at any book and they could tell you a verse that they'd never seen before and tell you what book it was from. And that, again, is explained a lot more in detail in this book, Sacred Relationships. But my belief is that this is not 3 books of poetry, 5 scrolls associated with holidays and other writings, but in fact, they are all tied together. The order that we have them today is not the original order that came about a couple thousand years ago. It's a more modern order. It's only about 1,000 or 1,300 years old. So I'm going to take for a moment a look at the original order and go through what each of these books deals with in Ketuvim. My belief, and it seems to be justified, and people who have studied it and then have looked at this interpretation believe that it's accurate. So I'm willing to share it in a lot of ways as well as it's been published. Each of these books is a how-to manual. It's a way of teaching the reader how to experience God in each type of relationship in life. Each book goes through a different psycho-emotional developmental stage, and each book tells us how we can find life. So just we'll go through very briefly, okay? Because if you want, this is an easy book to go through. It's written, to be able to be read in a short period of time. The first book traditionally is Ruth. This is the book about a woman whose husband dies. She has two daughter-in-laws. Her sons have died, and they are committed to being with her, and one stays with her. And this is the book of Ruth and Naomi. It is a book about relationship between daughter and mother, or between student and teacher, between mentor and mentee. And this book teaches us so beautifully how to experience God within the relationship with our mentors, our parents, our elders. If you have an issue that you're really not experiencing God in the relationship with your children or your parents, Ruth is a great book to read. The next book in the traditional order is a book of Psalms. And you'll see as we go through these that they actually track the psycho-emotional development of a person from childhood, where they're dealing with their parents, all the way through their life. The second book, Psalms, Tehillim, is written by King David. By the way, Ruth is about King David because the great-grandson, her great-grandson is King David. It talks about that as well. Psalms is about feelings. Most of Psalms is written by King David. And it's all about feelings. It's beautiful, beautiful poetry. And the poetry is everything from poetry about love to poetry about war to poetry about fear, brotherhood, sisterhood, business, all sorts of things. And it's really wonderful. Again, written by King David. There are 150 Psalms. We were taught that you should read all 150 every day, twice. Then it became, okay, the rabbis realized, well, people weren't reading them twice a day, just read it once. And then it became, they realized that people still weren't doing it, so they said, if you read the last 5 Psalms, it counts as if you read all 150. And then it gets to the point, okay, the people still aren't doing that. So if you just read the 150th Psalm, it counts as if you read the whole book. 150th song is Hallelujah, Hallel meaning praise, Leyah, to God. And the 150th Psalm says, we shall praise God with our harp, with the drum, with our voice, with dance, etc., etc. So the book of Psalms is all about finding and experiencing God within the relationship of our emotions, our feelings, like a child or teenager. The next book is this wonderful book called Job, or Eov. Job, which has 5 potential different authors. Many people believe it was written by Moses himself. The book of Eov, or Job, is a book of suffering, not pain, but suffering. Job is this great guy, and then bad things happen to him. If you want to understand the book of Job, there's a great movie with James Woods called Joshua Then and Now, many years ago. And I think it's Alan Arkin who plays James Woods' father, Joshua's father. And he explains the book of Job in the following basic way. He says, so Job's this righteous guy, and the devil Satan wants to make book with God that he can make him be bad. And so he throws all sorts of bad things on him, but still the guy doesn't go bad. That's kind of how Arkin explains it. It's kind of true. Job is a righteous man. Hasatan, which is not the devil. It's not Satan the way Christianity thinks. Hasatan is the angel that creates obstacles in our way so that we will become stronger. Hasatan says, Job is a very pious God, but only because everything's good in his life. So this book is about God saying you can take everything from him but his life, and Satan does. And still Job retains his faith. And it's very much about a story of faith. And when Job does question, then God actually says, where were you when I created the world? It's very much about faith. And it's about suffering. Now let's talk for a moment about suffering versus pain. Pain is when we know why we're feeling the pain. Suffering is when we don't. That's the simplest way of delineating between the two. So if you were to walk in and I was with a young person and I was yelling at them in a swimming pool and yelling at them to go faster and swim harder, you might say, boy, that rabbi's pretty abusive and mean to that young person. On the other hand, if you knew that young person had come to me and said, Rabbi, will you coach me so I can become a faster swimmer? Then you would say, he's giving him pain so he can grow. If you don't know why the pain is there, that's suffering. When we know why, because of other people, because of God, whatever reason, then it's just pain for our growth. So the book of Job is about pain without knowing why we have it. So it's about finding God in the midst of our suffering. The next book after that is the book of Michele, or Proverbs. This is written by King Solomon when he's a middle-aged man. And it's about finding and experiencing God within the workplace, within the marketplace. It's all about how do you deal with ethics? How do you deal with business ethics? How do you deal with relationships? The last chapter, Eshes Chayil, is a chapter about honoring your wife and how beautiful she is, how amazing she is. One of the things that happens to a lot of people, especially men, when they're out in the workplace, is they're working really hard so they can support their family, but then they forget that it's about their family. The work becomes more important than the relationship. And so we read to our wives, traditionally the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, we read it to our wives every Shabbat, every Sabbath. The book after that is another book written by King Solomon called Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes. This he writes when he is an old man. And often it's viewed as a book of futility, but that's not what it is at all. Solomon, by the time he's an old man, is able to see God and experience God in everything, in the vapor of vapors. Often it's translated as vanity of vanities, chevel chevelim. That's actually not. It's the phrase is vapor of vapors. That everything divine is so precious. All of life is so transient and so precious, so miraculous. So Kohelet, written by King Solomon, is all about experiencing God in everything, everywhere, and in everything. And it's a truly mystical book. After that, in our traditional order, we have a book called Shir HaShirim, also written by King Solomon, this time as a young man. Remember, as an old man, he wrote Ecclesiastes. As a middle-aged man, he wrote Proverbs. But as a young man, he wrote this book, Song of Songs. Song of Songs is an amazing piece of love poetry. It's first read publicly when the temple is consecrated, when it's dedicated, the first temple that Solomon builds. And like much mystical poetry, whether it's Rumi or Gibran, Ibn Gabirol, any of the mystical writings from any culture, the relationship between God and the human being is placed in terms that are very intimate. Because in some ways, the only thing that we can even touch, we can even talk about, that comes close to defining, comes close to really exploring and explaining the relationship of that mystical experience, when you know that God really does love you. You really know that. It's so intimate and so powerful. And the only words that we can use to describe it are the words used between a man and a wife making love. Song of Songs has some beautiful poetry. Most translations of most Bibles today use an allegorical translation or interpretation written by Rashi 1,000 years ago. But the book itself is so exquisite about the love sonnet, and it's also very much about God and the people of Israel. How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O prince's daughter. Your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of an artist. Your navel is like a round goblet that never lacks splendid wine. Your belly is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies, twins of a gazelle. It's just such beloved. I'm my beloved's, and his desires for me. Come, my beloved, let us go forth into the field. It's beautiful love sonnets that in many cases are very explicit. But it's both about the relationship between a man and a woman, and it's also about the relationship between God and us as individuals. So again, Solomon, as a young man, writes Song of Songs, and often that's where young men find a divine experience, is in the intimacy of making love. As a middle-aged man, he writes Proverbs, which is about finding God, experiencing God in the workplace, and as an old man, he writes Ecclesiastes, experiencing God in everything. The book after that, again in Ketuvim, is a book called Echa. It's translated as Lamentations. The word means how, and it's a double entendre. It's the question mark, how did this happen to us? And it's the answer, this is how it happened to us. It is a description of many of the tragedies that the Jewish people have experienced up to that point when it's written, including the destruction of the temple. After that is probably the hardest book in the Bible to understand. It's the book of Daniel. Daniel is a very confusing book. It's written in a multiplicity of linguistic styles. And it really is finding God in time and timelessness. That's why there's a lot of prophecy. The understanding that from God's point of view, past, present, and future are the same. But from our point of view, it's not. And to experience God in that timeless quality. God is more than just here and now, or more than was, or more than will be. After Daniel, we have a book called Esther, probably the most argued about book in the Bible. This is the story of Esther and the story that we honor during the holiday of Purim. And nowhere in this book is God's name mentioned. It's a fascinating book. If you really look at it Everyone in this book, the story is that there's a king, a drunken king. He's an alcoholic named King Ahasuerus. His name, Ahashverosh, literally means a pain in the head. And Ahasuerus wants his queen Vashti to dance naked in front of the ministers. Vashti says no. He says, if you don't dance for my ministers, you're not going to be queen. She says, fine, I'm out of here. And she leaves. Now, Ahasuerus has a minister named Haman. And Haman says, let's have a beauty contest, decide who's going to be the next queen. There's a Jewish guy named Mordecai, his niece or goddaughter or ward. Her name is Esther. She's very beautiful. He convinces Esther that she should enter this contest. She wins. She becomes queen. Haman ends up hating the Jews because they won't bow to him. And so he convinces the drunken king to have all of the Jews killed in the town of Shushan in Persia. And Mordecai convinces Esther that she needs to go talk to the king and convince him with her womanly wiles, which that's a polite way of saying what she does. And she convinces him that he should think about this a little bit more. And she tells him that she wants to have a party, just him, the king, her, and Haman. So Haman's invited. When the king gets up, she says, up, Haman tried to rape me. The king gets furious. He impales Haman and his 7 sons, or his 10 sons, excuse me. And the Jews are saved. Everyone in this book is obsessive, compulsive, or addictive. Ahasuerus is drunk on alcohol. Esther is drunk on her beauty and sexuality. Haman is drunk on power. Mordecai, when he becomes the chief minister, he gets drunk on power and kills all the Persians. Everyone is obsessive. Everyone is excessive, with one exception, Vashti, who says, I won't play. And this is a book that's an amazing book to understand how to find God when God is seemingly absent in the world of addiction, in the world of excessive behavior. And very powerful book for people who are going through addiction recovery, people who are related or have friends who are in addiction recovery. Powerful, powerful book to understand that we don't negotiate with an addiction. We cut it out. We walk away just like Vashti did. After Esther, we have the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah are 2 books combined as one, or 1 book split into 2, depending on how you look at it. And this takes place after the destruction of the temple. And Ezra and Nehemiah are the guys who convince the Babylon king to be able to rebuild the temple in Israel. And they're the leaders, both from a physical and a spiritual point of view. Nehemiah the physical, Ezra the spiritual. And it's a wonderful, wonderful understanding of, I truly love Nehemiah, because he, even though it's ostensibly all physical, everything he does is about service to God. After that, we have the book of Chronicles, which is all about experiencing God from the beginning. This Chronicles starts from the beginning and traces the whole history of this book, the Tanakh. Ezra and Nehemiah, by the way, are about what you do when you can experience God in every kind of relationship. The only answer is to serve, to build a temple, to serve God with all your heart, with all your mind. So Ketuvim is a wonderful series of books. Our Christian and Catholic brothers and sisters love using them. They're wonderful writings, teachings. But I think that really to explore them is a beautiful journey. And especially if you look at them as each book, not a book of poetry or just random thoughts, but rather each book teaches us how to experience God in different scenarios, in different relationships. And with that, we end this entire book, the Tanakh. We have the Torah, the first 5 books, Ketuvim, the prophets, and then, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and then Ketuvim, the writings, and that finishes the Tanakh. Now let's go back through a little bit of history. As we discussed last week, in 722 before the Common Era, the kingdoms are split. There's a northern kingdom, or before that, they're split, but in 722, the northern kingdom is destroyed. We have the 10 lost tribes. In 586 before the Common Era, 586 or 587, depending on who you ask, the southern kingdom of Judah is conquered. Most of the Jews go to Babylon. Some stay in Israel. By the way, the ones that go to Babylon, when Ezra and Nehemiah bring them back to Israel, some of them stay in Babylon. And those that stay in Babylon are there for literally 2,500 years until they come out of, in the 1970s, come out of what was Babylon and becomes Persia and ultimately becomes Iran. And they come out. So that community, if you want to really see some biblical customs, look at some of the customs in the Persian Jewish community, how they the rabbi is not in front of the people, but rather is in the center. Some of the beautiful customs that you find, because they're really very biblical, because they go back, they stayed in one place for 2,500 years. So the people have dispersed, and they come back, and they are again in Israel. They build the second temple. Things are going fine, and then they ultimately will get destroyed and conquered again because they forget to live according to God's ways. Now, in that time, there's two things going on. There's the kingship in Israel, and there's also what's called the Sanhedrin, the assembly. These are the rabbis. These are the men of wisdom who are trained and they apprentice, and they're the court. It's really what they are, and they base their judgments upon what it says in the Torah. Now, this becomes extremely important. We're going to start bouncing around in time a little bit. If we get to in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Jews are all over the place, and the Maccabees, which is Hanukkah, the Maccabees revolt. They're spiritual leaders, and they revolt. And again, we have a kingdom that is dedicated to God, but that changes too. And by 70 of the Common Era, the Second Temple is destroyed, and then we're dispersed everywhere in the world by the Romans. But in that period of the Second Temple, something starts called the Sanhedrin, the Great Assembly, these rabbis, and they're looking at dialogues, and they're arguing about things. And from this we get Talmud, which is what I really wanted to get to tonight. You will find on your video, I believe in YouTube or at the bottom of the page, there's a link that you can download a handout. This is going to be a Talmudic handout you're going to need for the next couple of weeks. And I think it's really important to kind of explore a little bit. What is Talmud? Why is Talmud? Why is it so important? So we have the written Torah. This is given by God. This is the traditional way of understanding. This is written by God, or dictated by God, written by Moses. But there are parts in this text that aren't clear. There are parts in the text of the Torah where God says, "As I have told you," but nowhere before did he tell Moses this. So here's the tradition. That God says, Moses, write down stuff, but God also tells things to Moses. So I'm going to give an example. God says, Moses, I want you to write down, you should protect the Sabbath. And Moses writes down, you should protect the Sabbath. And then Moses says, God, what does that mean? And God says, well, you can do this, you cannot do this, you cannot do this, you can do this. It says in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, which is what we're studying in a moment, part of Talmud, it's on the first page of your handout. It says, Moses received the Torah from Sinai, and he passed it to Joshua. Joshua passed it on to the elders to the prophets passed it on to the men of the Great Assembly. So it's an oral Torah, it's an oral tradition. And when it comes down to the court, this Sanhedrin, this assembly, people come with a question, and the rabbis come up with an answer. And here's how they do it. So a woman comes to the court, and she says, am I allowed to move a bottle of water that's less than half full more than a foot on a table? And Rabbi Orlando says, I was taught by my grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by Joshua, who was taught by Moses, that no, you cannot. And Rabbi David says, wait a minute, I was taught by my grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by his grandfather, who was taught by Joshua, who was taught by Moses, that you can. And they argue about it. Can you move this bottle? They're generally more important issues than can you move a bottle of water? And they ultimately say one of three answers. We side with Rabbi Orlando, we side with Rabbi David, or they say teku, which means we have absolutely no idea. The Messiah will tell us when he shows up. These dialogues explore the Torah more and more and more. And they explore what the inner meanings are. And so Torah's always living, it's always breathing, because there's always these interpretations of it. Now, eventually what happens after the destruction of the Second Temple is the head of the assembly, a man named Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince, writes down a lot of these dialogues that people had. And he writes it down, and because they'd also been written down before him, but he takes it all and he compiles it all on these discussions, these debates. And the word in Hebrew for debates, machloches or machlochet, they take these debates and he writes them all down. This becomes what is known as Mishnah. Now, the term Talmud means you will learn or you will study or you will teach. And organizationally, it's composed of two pieces. The Mishnah, which was composed by Rabbi Judah Hanasi, and the Gemara, which are additional, means additional. The Gemara is additional dialogues on top of what Judah Hanasi said. So we have the Mishnah and the Gemara. There are multiple tractates in the Talmud, and every tractate, with the exception of one, has Mishnah and Gemara in it. The one that doesn't is this thing called Pirkei Avot. You'll find it at the beginning of your handout, where it talks about chapter 1, a couple of lines from Pirkei Avos, meaning ethics of our fathers. But Talmud, and to put it in perspective, this is 1/3 of the tractate, called Masechta, that's the word for tractate. This is 1/3 of the tractate Baba Metzia, meaning the middle gate. And you can see it's pretty serious. This is the page. This is English translations. Here's the text. Here's commentaries on it, called Tosafot. To study one page a day of the entire Talmud, so if you study this whole page, which ends up being about 4 to 5 pages of English translation, by the way. Study one page. If you study a page a day, which is a lot, then it takes you just over 7 years to finish the Talmud. 7 years. The question isn't how much of the Talmud did you go through. The question is how much Talmud went through you. But the Talmud has all sorts of amazing things. And one of the things to understand is, remember, these are dialogues and arguments. And think about it as if you had a dinner table of 8 or 10 people. Now, the assembly was 71 people, by the way. And the law was that if someone came with a question before the court and all 71 people agreed, the decision was thrown out, because they recognized that 71 people agreeing on anything, there's some corruption going on. So you would never have a unanimous decision. But dialogues happen organically. And I think it's so hard to teach this without people in front and having dialogues. So if you have questions, if you're on Facebook, chime them in or whatever it may be. Human beings do not think linearly. Okay? Think about it. We don't think that way. You have a memory about being with grandpa with your father at a concert with Carlos Santana at the Hollywood Bowl. And then that sparks a memory about when you were having Mexican food with your cousin. And then that sparks a memory about how when your cousin and you were at a Japanese restaurant. And that sparks a memory of when you and your wife took a cruise to Japan. And that sparks a memory of how you were taking a cruise with your grandchildren once down or up to Alaska. Our minds do not work linearly. Our minds work circuitously. They do not work linearly. Now, in Western culture, we are taught A leads to B leads to C leads to D, and so on. We are taught to think linearly, but that's not how the human mind works. That's never how a conversation works, is it? I was having a conversation today with a friend in England, and we talked about everything from the political craziness going on in the world right now to his favorite tequila brand, to when he's coming back to the States, to a relationship he was in, to things at the temple. We talked about all sorts of things because that's how conversations grow organically. We may start on this topic, but we go all over the map. Right? Human beings generally do not think A leads to B leads to C leads to D. That's not how we have conversation. Well, the discussions in the Talmud are the same. They are not linear. And if you try to understand and read the Talmud in a linear way, you will literally break your teeth. It's just too challenging because it's like following a dialogue, following a conversation. If you allow Talmud to be like a symphony and just follow the music, then it's just beautiful. It's wonderful. There's a wonderful teacher of Talmud, and I recommend it highly to everyone. It's my friend Sal Litvak. He has a website called theaccidentaltalmudist.com. It does emails, has all sorts of wonderful teachings, and I think he even has a daily class. But Talmud is meant to be experienced, to let it go through you. If I'm telling you now, if you try and study Talmud and think of it linearly, like a Germanic Protestant professor of mathematics, you're only going to get frustrated. If you allow it to move beautifully like a flowing river, then there is nothing better. As a young man, I thought that Talmud was just for old men who had too much time on their hands. When I got older, now I believe that Talmud holds the secrets of the universe. Now that means one of two things are a possibility. Either it holds the secrets of the universe, or I recognize it's also a possibility I've become an old man with too much time on my hands. But I think it's the first. It really is an amazing, amazing document that is the heart of Judaism. Because once we're dispersed in 70 of the Common Era, and we leave Israel, how do we continue to practice Judaism without our native homeland? And Talmud really gives us the methodology to do it. We do not today typically live a biblical lifestyle. We live a rabbinic lifestyle based on Talmud. The most observant Jew in the world is living a rabbinic lifestyle based on Talmud, not a biblical lifestyle per se. If you want a great book that talks about that, there's a very fun book called The Year of Living Biblically, which is about a writer from, I think, Vanity Fair. He took a year and he decided that he was going to live a purely biblical lifestyle. And every day he took on a different commandment and he tried to live a biblical lifestyle in today's world. It's actually a very fun book. I think they made a horrible movie of it. I never saw it, but the book is actually really interesting when he realizes that there's a biblical commandment. You're supposed to stone the idol worshiper. And he's walking by kids and they're playing with little toys, little animal toys. And he goes, okay, that's idol worship, but I can't kill the kid by stoning. He kind of kicks some dirt. So he figures he's stoning the kid. But we don't live biblically. We live rabbinically. Okay? There's a question somewhere. And the question is
there a Reform versus Orthodox, etc. version of the Talmud?
No, the Talmud is the Talmud. Talmud is the Talmud. Now, what you listen with, like anything, what you choose to study, you choose to study. But the Talmud is the basis of Judaism. And we're going to get later on what Reform and Orthodox Judaism is. Understand that there were no movements until approximately 250 to 300 years ago. Not even 300, 250 years ago. So this is the vast majority of Jewish history. The movements of Reform, Conservative, Orthodox are blink in the eye. They're really, and they probably are no longer going to exist much longer. And more and more the movements have been getting dispersed. Synagogues like ours are what are called trans-denominational or post-denominational. We use a conservative prayer book. We do a lot of it in English. We look at traditional, authentic Jewish theology. So the Talmud is the Talmud. Just is what it is. Now, structurally, there's the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? There's the document by Judah Hanasi, the Mishnah, which has a lot of dialogues, and then there's the Gemara, which has other dialogues. Thematically, there's also two aspects to Talmud: Halacha and Agadah. Halacha is generally translated as meaning law. What it literally means, it comes from the word lalechet, meaning a way of going. So it's a pathway of going. That's literally what halacha means. Agadah means stories. So in these dialogues between many of the sages, these machlokets, these debates, as in any conversation, people are joining in the conversation and getting out. And let's go back to the water idea, okay? So Rabbi Orlando says you can move it. Rabbi David says you cannot, based on what their great-grandfathers. And then they said, and then the other rabbis start chiming in and they start saying, well, I learned this. And then they say, in the book of Exodus, it says this. And they say in the book of Proverbs, it says this. So they start taking from other teachings intratextually from the Tanakh, from the Bible. And while they're doing that, someone says, I remember there was a time when I moved a bottle of water and it spilled all over. I wonder if that was a sign from God. And then that sparks the idea, another rabbi says, you may be right. When water falls over, maybe it's a sign from God. It's like a waterfall. And then some other guy says, waterfalls really are very divine because out of the water, out of the rocks come this water and it cleanses and it's moving and it's very quick. And another guy says, that's just sort of like when we wash clothes. And I remember when my wife was washing clothes once, she was washing the clothes And my tallis she was washing, and she ripped it while she was washing. And I thought to myself, is this a sign from God? Should I? And it tells this whole story about his ripped tallis. And then some other guy chimes in and talks about his tallis and how he was sewing it up once. And another one starts telling a story about, well, I heard from whomever that that God wears a tallis and God wears tefillin. And in fact, the tefillin, the head tefillin that God wears is the knot that's in the back. This knot that's right back there. That when God takes Moses and he puts him in a cleft, when Moses says that I want to see God's face, and God says no one can see my face and live. God puts him in a cleft. He says, I'll pass by you, and you can see the back of my head. That in fact Moses sees the tefillin knot of God, and it calls out God's name, the 13 midot, Adonai, Adonai, Rachum v'chanim. And so this rabbi tells that whole story. So somehow we've gone from moving a bottle of water to a waterfall to a story about a ripped tallis when it was being washed to God having tefillin knots, because that's just how the dialogue went. That, by the way, that dialogue doesn't happen in Talmud, to my best of my knowledge, but we're just using that as an example. So some of it is halacha, law. Can you move the bottle? Some of it is agadah, stories. Moses saw God's tefillin knot, or my tallis was ripped when it was being washed by my wife, and what do we do, and all those things. Just like any conversation, if you sit with someone for a lengthy period of time, past stories get involved, myths get involved, teachings get involved. All sorts of things happen because conversations are not linear. That's a lecture. That's why I don't like doing this, quite honestly, on camera as opposed to having dialogue. It's very strange to me because it's hard to have the questions that become so exciting and demonstrate what Talmud really is. So these dialogues, some about halakha, law, some about agadah, lore or stories, are all interwoven. And typically after all that, it comes back to, can the bottle be moved or not, or whatever the question was. But there are teachings in the agadah. Now, the vast majority of rabbis that you will study with in your lifetime will say that the halakha, the law, is important, and the stories, who cares? I side with the minority, and I recognize I side with the minority, but since Rabbi Heschel, blessed memory, is on my side, as well as a lot of other great rabbis, I figure I'm in an okay company, which is that the agadah is really so important, the stories, and the halakha comes out of the agadah, not the other way around. Law comes out of the stories, not the stories out of the law. That is a minority opinion. That is not what you will learn in a classic Orthodox yeshiva. That is not what you will learn in a classic Talmud class, whether it's in a Reform synagogue. Most Reform synagogues don't even study Talmud, or whether it's an Orthodox shul. That's what I believe. So, as an example, I think that elders and people who are wise speak in story type of language, Haggadic type of material, while they're giving halakha. So let us say, for argument's sake, that we were dealing with a question, legal questions about intimate relationships between a husband and a wife. Okay? And so we're talking this very specifically. And my 11-year-old twins walk in the room. Suddenly, we're going to change our topic, but we're still going to talk about it in a different way. So I might say, when the artist takes his paintbrush and he dips it in the paint, and he puts it on the canvas and he starts painting, and we all know what I'm talking about if you're an adult. But am I really talking about a paintbrush and paint, or am I talking about something else? That kind of language is found, not about the intimacy, but that kind of language is found constantly in the Talmud, which deals with everything. We do a monthly class called Talmud and Tobacco. About half the people don't smoke cigars, but it's done at Stonehouse or at Bogies. The synagogue provides cigars. People buy their own drinks, and we study Talmud. You typically would not study Talmud in a Reform synagogue. You typically would not study it at Stonehouse or in a place where people are drinking or smoking cigars in an Orthodox shul. But it brings people together in a community. We take a private area. And we study a different topic every month. This past month, we talked about war and peace, conflict and resolution in Judaism. We've talked about dream interpretation, Jewish astrology. There's a class that I only teach this to married men. I will not teach this to women. There's a class in intimate marital relations. The Talmud is very specific, it's much more so than the Kama Sutra. There's taught a class in money management in Judaism, all different kinds of topics, healing the sick, all sorts of funerals, weddings, all sorts of different topics. And I'll pull different pages from the Talmud and we'll study them together in a traditional way, which is that you read and then you dialogue about what you read. That's how we traditionally study this, in what's called chavruta, with friends. So Talmud's meant to be studied with someone else or with other people. And again, it's the dialogue that happens as a result, the opening of our souls through that dialogue, through that exploration together. So in the Talmud, there are all these different tractate or masechta. They range from, some of them up here, but Achot, which is about blessings, Pirkei Avot, the one that does not have a Gemara, which is all about ethics of our fathers, ethical book. Sanhedrin, about the assembly, Rosh Hashanah, about Rosh Hashanah, Yoma, about Yom Kippur, Bava Metzia, the middle gate, which has to do with commerce, and all these different topics. And things get woven in. Just because we start on this topic doesn't mean that we stay there. We may start here, go all the way around circuitously before we come back here to an answer to what the question is before the court. Constantly in the Talmud, we have sages who are arguing with each other. They represent two different sides. And this is so important, and this is why I really wanted to get to Talmud today, because it has been a challenging week for this nation. And I think it's really, really important to understand how we as Jews deal with conflict and how we deal with opponents. In Judaism, we recognize that since God is infinite, no one person, no one faith tradition, no one political party, no one group has the exclusive monopoly on understanding God, because God is infinite. So it is through our dialogue we start to understand God better. We start to understand life deeper. We don't think of our enemies as evil. They may do evil actions, God forbid. We don't think of them as evil. We think of them as wrong. We think of them as another way of understanding the universe. We remember that they are also God's creatures. And so in our tradition, and we see this a lot in Talmud, there's a question coming up, yes. We see this a lot in Talmud, that the dialogue between two opposing views is so, so important. Because the minority opinion is also important. Before we get to the question, a couple of examples. There's a dialogue. It says that you shall write on the doorposts of your house the commandments, and that's where we get a mezuzah from. Now, most of you, if you're Jewish, have a mezuzah, at least on your front door. Ideally, we want to have them on every door except the bathroom. And you've been told that the mezuzah should be placed at an angle. So it should be, at this angle, so the good energy stays in, or so the bad energy stays out, or whatever it may be. You know why you place the mezuzah on an angle? Because there's a dialogue in the Talmud, and one school, one rabbi is saying, says you should place these commandments on the doorpost of your house, and they should be placed vertically. And the other guy says, no, they should be placed horizontally. You know what happens? They compromise. They say place it at an angle. If you look at a Hanukkah Menorah, Hanukkah, there's a shamash, and a helper, and 8 branches, one for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah. And there's discussion between Shammai and Hillel. These are two sages who are always battling each other. And Shammai says you should start with 8 candles and work your way down to 1, because the oil became less and less each day. And Hillel says, no, the miracle becomes greater every day, so we should start with 1 and move up to 8, plus it feels nicer. So we side with Hillel. And so most of us start the first night with 1 night, the second night with 2 nights, 2 candles. But if you walked into a Jewish home on the first night of Hanukkah and all 8 candles were lit, that would be kosher, it would be okay. Because Shammai, you say, I'm going according to the ruling of Shammai, not according to the ruling of Hillel. So the argument allows us to see more perspectives. We do not look for victory, we look for harmony. Say that again. When we are with our opponent, we are not looking for victory. We're passionate about what we believe, and we want to convince them that we're right, and we want them ultimately to side with us. What we're really looking for is harmony, much more so than victory or destruction. Lenny said there was a question from someone.
Yes. What is the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud from Israel?
It's called the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. Most of us read, most of the time what we study is called the Bavli or Babylonian Talmud. That's compiled and edited, and it's done in Babylon, as opposed to there's still with the head of the head of the Jews that are dispersed, as opposed to the one that's done in Jerusalem. Most of the time we actually look at the Bavli, they're very, very similar. There are a few exceptions, a few differences, but they're very, very similar, both in their organizational skills, but organizational structure, but also in how what the teachings are and the quotes are. There are some quotes that are slightly different, but they're pretty much very, very similar documents. Okay, so when I speak of Talmud, I speak of Babylonian because that's what most of us study most of the time. But they are extremely similar. The Yerushalmi and the Bavli are very, very similar. They're structured the same way. I hope that answered the question. So throughout the Talmud, you have multiple dialogues, multiple fights, right? And what are we going to do with them? How do we do them? And they're constantly between two opposing sages who often have respect for each other. And there's a piece of Talmud, there's a couple pieces I'd like to go over tonight from your handout. Two in particular, we just already went through the first, which is about Pirkei Avot, which is about the issue of where the Talmud comes from, this oral Torah comes from. This is a true statement. You cannot understand Judaism if you do not understand Talmud, if you've not explored Talmud. You cannot understand Judaism in the 21st century. We don't practice Judaism the way it was done biblically. We practice it rabbinically. And it's so, so important to understand that. For many, many decades, the Talmud was even ignored in the Reform movement because it just was like something, who cares? It's Orthodox. It's a primary part of Judaism that we need to study. Maybe we don't need to, if you live a more Reform lifestyle, maybe it's not so important that you know how much distance there has to be between a milk dish and a meat dish, and how maybe that's not so important to you. But the theology, the understanding of thinking, and that's the most important part, and that's what this whole series of classes is about, is thinking Jewishly. See, we're Jews. We don't think traditionally in that Germanic A leads to B leads to C leads to D leads to E. That's not how we think. We don't think, quote unquote, rationally. Neither do we think irrationally, or it's just like crazy people. Many Jews are Meshuggah, but no, that's not what we do. We think non-rationally. Jewish thought is non-rational. It's the way the universe really works. A doesn't always lead to B leading to C. Sometimes A goes to X, which goes to Roman numeral 5, which goes to C, which goes to G, which comes back to B. That's how Talmud teaches us to think. If you try and think and go through it as, again, linearly, it doesn't work. But if we let it go through us, we learn to think in a different way. This is one of the big reasons that traditional Jewish education has taught people to become lawyers or judges or scientists, people who see the world in both a microcosmic and a macrocosmic way, because that's Jewish thinking. That's who we are. We look at many perspectives, not just one. And that's what Talmud teaches us to do. Talmud, the study of Talmud, teaches us to not only respect what someone believes or is arguing that's different than our own belief or argument, but it starts to understand how can we integrate both together to a higher truth. Then I want to study a simple piece of document that kind of explains this, and I think it's really important right now, because all too often what I'm hearing for the last week is not a dialogue of they're wrong, they're right, but rather they're evil. And that's just not how we think as Jews. We don't view the world that way traditionally. I recently heard I was on a panel and recently heard some spiritual leaders. It was about peace, this panel, theory. And one of these spiritual leaders was talking. It was a panel for peace. And this spiritual leader, doesn't matter who or where, was saying, love is the most powerful force in the universe. Love conquers hate. Love conquers anger. Love conquers fear. I understand that this particular spiritual leader is politically extremely far left. Okay, just put that out about them. And so this person says, love conquers everything, and we need to have faith, and we need to embrace that all-encompassing love so we can destroy the evil president and all of his followers. And they didn't even see the irony. They were saying, love everyone and destroy your enemy who's evil. That's not Jewish thinking. It just isn't. That's not how we interact with the world. To say on either side of the political spectrum this week, for anyone to say that those people who support Joe Biden are evil, or those people who support Donald Trump are evil, means you are saying that 60 million people, 70 million people, half the nation is evil. That's not okay. And it's not going to bring peace. So we don't use those kind of terms. We don't use that kind of language. They may do evil action. We may think they're crazy. We may think they're wrong. And we may feel we need to convince them what is right. But to say what this person said, that love is the most powerful thing, so we need to use love so we can destroy these people, that just isn't Jewish. That's just not how we think. We don't view the world that way. And before going into the Talmud, there's a Midrash story that when the Hebrews had gotten out of the land of Egypt and they had crossed the Sea of Reeds, and Pharaoh's soldiers were in the Sea of Reeds, and the waters crashed upon them and killed all of Pharaoh's soldiers. The story is, it's only about 2,000 plus years old. The story is that the angels started to rejoice. And God looked at the angels and said, the work of my hands is being destroyed, and you want to sing hymns of praise? Stop that. From our point of view, we realize that, and this again is, we learn this in really, really exploring Talmud. From our point of view, those soldiers of Pharaoh had to be killed. That wasn't a question. They had to be destroyed for what they were doing. But we don't rejoice in it. We are not the terrorists in the Middle East who are screaming in joy when 9/11 happens, God forbid. That's not Jewish. We don't rejoice in victory over those we disagree with. I'm always brought back to this memory. A number of years ago, they were broadcasting the destruction of these terror tunnels coming from Gaza with these terrorists coming underneath. And I was walking into a place, and as I walked in, and they had CNN on or whatever they had, these guys are screaming like it's a football game. I said, Rabbi, you got to come see this. Rabbi, you got to come see this. And what it was film footage of these Arab terrorists, these young men, coming through the tunnel, and then a big explosion in the tunnel crashing down on them. And they're cheering like it's UCLA versus USC. Look, isn't that great? Look how they all got killed. And I looked at them, I said, you guys are jerks. Every one of you. Do you not realize we just made 100 parents lose their son? We just made 100 children orphans. This isn't going to lead to peace. We had to do it, no question. And it was the right thing to do, and it's what we needed to do. But we don't rejoice in their defeat. That's not the Jewish way. Better, they should have said, you know what, let's live with our neighbors in peace. Then we should have to destroy them. As Golda Meir said, we can forgive the Arabs for killing us. We cannot forgive them for making us kill them. So we fight evil always. Talmud Ratad, if a crime is committed across the river, you do nothing to prevent it, you're guilty of the crime. But we do not rejoice in the victory just because it had to be done if it destroys anyone. That's why it was such an irony that this spiritual leader was saying, let's love so we can destroy this person. It doesn't make sense. So I want to demonstrate this or illustrate this with a really terrific story. If you look in your handout, and let me take a quick look as to so I can tell you what page it's on. It's the page that's on the top of it. It says Reish Lakish, or Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And you will find it in your handout on page, forgive me for not knowing this off the top of my head, but it's a download. So It's the Talmud 1 handout. You will find it on page 6. Where on the top it says Yochanan Reish Lakish. This is from chapter 7 of the tractate Bava Metzia, the Middle Gate. A lot of this has to do with commerce. A lot of this has to do with how we act in business ethics, things like that. But there's this story. Now, in the Talmud's not written linearly, right? So there's stories about Hillel versus Shammai over here, and then there's stories about Hillel versus Shammai over here, and over here, and over here, all over. It's not written linearly. And two of the sparring partners, two rabbis who were great rabbis, who were constantly battling each other, one is named Rabbi Yochanan, and one is named Reish Lakish, or Bar Lakish, the son of Lakish. And they are best friends, they're brother-in-laws, and they're always arguing with each other. This is from Bava Metzia. You'll see there's a line. Now, when you look at this text, if it is dark print, that is what the text actually says. And then you see light print after it. The Talmud is written in a form of shorthand. And the editor of this, which is the Schottenstein edition, has put in other words to make the sentence clearer for the reader, more explainable, more understandable. But the Talmud itself is written in shorthand. So as an example, what this actually says is one day Rabbi Yochanan was swimming in the Jordan. Reish Lakish saw him and jumped into the Jordan after him. But we're going to read it with the whole sentence, which includes an understanding. The Gemara records the story of the relationship between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The narrative begins before Reish Lakish's rise to eminence. One day, Rabbi Yochanan was swimming in the Jordan River. Reish Lakish, who was then a highwayman, he was a thief. He was more than a thief. If it was a crime, he was doing it. Reish Lakish saw him and jumped into the Jordan after him. Now, why? We read throughout the Talmud about Yochanan that Yochanan may have been the most beautiful man who ever lived. He had long dark hair down to his tuchus. He was in perfect shape. So Reish Lakish, who does a lot of not good actions, sees this naked person out swimming in the river with long dark hair. He thinks, good looking girl, I'm going to go out and have my way with her. So he takes off all his clothes and he swims out to the Jordan, finds Rabbi Yochanan, and whoop! You're not a good looking girl, there's your man. Kind of surprised. But he jumps out with such passion because he's going to go out of his way with what he thinks is a woman. He does it with full and complete passion, vitality. Rabbi Yochanan beheld this display of vitality and said to Reish Lakish, your strength should go to the Torah, belongs to the Torah. And Reish Lakish said to him, well, your beauty should belong to women because he's so beautiful. Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, if you will fully repent of your ways, I will give you my sister in marriage, and she is more beautiful than I. At which point, Reish Lakish accepted this upon himself. Reish Lakish then wanted to swim back to return to retrieve his clothes, but he was unable to muster the strength to do so because he had totally given 100% of his passion to Torah now, to learning and living Torah. 100%. Remember that when we learned about King David a couple of weeks ago? When he was sad, he gave 100% to asking forgiveness. A Jew gives 110% all the time. We leave nothing on the table. We put it all out there. We're passionate in our joys and our pains. We're passionate in our arguments. I remember being at Loyola, and my friend Rabbi Arthur Gross Schaefer, who's one of the chairs of the business school and rabbi there, and we were discussing the Hillel program, and we would get into really passionate arguments about we should do this or not do this. And our priest friends would look at us and say, how can they be friends? They're arguing with each other. But as all of us who are Jewish know, that's one way through the dialogue that we become closer. So Reish Lakish gives all his vitality, and he doesn't even have the strength to go back to retrieve his clothes. Rabbi Yochanan afterwards taught him scripture and Mishnah and made him into a great man, into a rabbi. And the narrative continues. Again, this is the story of the beginning of the relationship and the end. One day, many years later, they were disputing the following point in the study hall. The Mishnah states that the sword and the knife and the hunting spear and the military spear and the hand sickle and the harvesting sickle, from what point are they capable of becoming impure? It is from the time of the completion of the production. So you're making a knife. If it is to be used to cut meat or to slice butter, it has one value, it's tahor. And if it's used to, it's going to be used to kill people, then it has a different value. It's not tahor, it's tameh. Okay, and so they're discussing at what point can we determine what it's going to be used for. And the text says at the time of their completion. But when is the time of their production, or the completion of their production? When is the completion of the production, is the question asked. Rabbi Yochanan says it's when the metal utensils are tempered in the furnace. Reish Lakish says, no, it's when they're polished with water. So this is an argument about when is this knife or sickle going to be used as a weapon as opposed to be used for a peaceful. When is its identity determined? And one could say that this is not just about a knife or a sickle. It could also be about human beings, children, or adults. But at what point is its identity determined that it is tameh, impure, or tahor, pure? And Yochanan teaches it is when the metal is tempered in the furnace, and Reish Lakish says, no, it's after they're polished with water. Now it gets ugly, and it gets ugly. Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, a thief knows the tools of his thievery, because remember, Reish Lakish had been a thief. So he's bringing up the past. Now, you don't have to answer, you can't ask this because we're not in the same room, but is it ever good to bring up past history in an argument or a fight? That is never a good plan if you want the relationship to succeed, right? So we learned that that's not a good idea. We're going to learn that. So Yochanan, he says with disdain to Reish Lakish, a thief knows the tool of his thievery. And Reish Lakish replied to him, how have you just benefited me? There, when I was among the thieves, they called me rabbi. In other words, I was their leader. And here, among all these sages, they call me rabbi. I'm their leader. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I benefited you in that I was the one who brought you under the wings of the Shekhinah, under the divine presence. So now he's saying, since I taught you Torah, I get to insult you when I want. Does anyone think that's okay? That's just going to lead to tragedy. We know that. Human condition is the human condition. And Rabbi Yochanan became disheartened, and Reish Lakish became seriously ill. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's sister, who was Reish Lakish's wife, came before Yochanan, and she cried and she pleaded with Yochanan to pray for Reish Lakish's recovery. She said to her brother Yochanan, act for the sake of my children. In other words, prevent their father from dying. And Yochanan replied to her with a verse from the book of Jeremiah, which says, leave your orphans, I will sustain them. She said, act for the sake of my impending widowhood, because if my husband dies, I will be a widow. And again, Yochanan responds with a quote from Jeremiah. He said to her, let your widows trust in me. This is not going to lead well, is it? This is not a healthy relationship. They're best friends, brother-in-laws, they're sparring partners, and now the fight's gotten ugly because they insulted each other. Rabbi Yochanan agreed, and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Bar Lakisha, died, passed away. But Rabbi Yochanan grieved after him considerably. The rabbis said, who should go to bring comfort to Yochanan's mind? Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedas should go because his scholarship is brilliant. He's a brilliant man, and he's going to make Yochanan feel better. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Pedas, who was a great, great sage, went and sat before Yochanan. And to everything Rabbi Yochanan would say, Rabbi Eliezer told him, we learned in the text, there's a text that supports you. So Yochanan would say, you can move the bottle of water, and Eliezer would say, you're right. And he would say, you can move the phone, and Eliezer said, it says you're right. Everything Yochanan would say, Rabbi Eliezer would say, you're right. Rabbi Yochanan eventually said to Rabbi Eliezer, you're supposed to be like Bar Lakisha, like Reish Lakish. With Bar Lakisha, whenever I would say something, he would pose 24 difficulties to me, and I would give him 24 new solutions. And as a result of this give and take, an understanding of the subject became clear. However, you, Eliezer, you constantly say, we learned something that supports you. What do I need this for? Do not I already know that I have said well? Rabbi Yochanan would go about in his hair's clothes and would cry and would say, where are you, Reish Lakish? Where are you, Bar Lakisha? Where are you, Bar Lakisha? And he would scream until he went crazy and his sanity wore away from him because he missed his friend. And the rabbis prayed for mercy on Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan died and passed away. Horrible story. The beginning and end of the relationship. What do we learn from this? We learn, first of all, don't bring up past things in an argument, which anyone knows, anyone who's been in a healthy relationship knows that never works. It just doesn't. It's not a good idea. But we learn something also equally and maybe even more important on a macro level. God is infinite. It's the exploration between us and those we oppose that we can start to understand things better. They may be wrong. We may be convinced they're wrong. They may be convinced we're wrong. But by having dialogue with respect, not tolerate. Oh God, I hate this word when someone says, oh, we need to tolerate our enemy, our opponent. That's chazarai. It's not about tolerating them. That shows that you think you're so much better. We need to try and convince them, and we need to understand why they think the way they think. We need to stop them if we believe they're doing evil actions, but we need to understand at a different level so we can understand God, which is infinite. This is a Jewish way of looking at things. An example that I like to give is, I have a friend, Bo Hardison. Bo, for many years ago, decades ago, worked with Sam Walton at Walmart. He's one of the executives. And he tells the story of how when Sam Walton, well, obviously we all know, became rather successful, that Sam would send his executives to go walk other stores so he could see what his competition was doing. And an executive would come back and he would say, well, Sam, Mr. Walton, that store we're doing better on this part, on this part, on this part than that store. We're doing better than this and this and this. We have our counters in better places. We have our cashiers in better places. We have our products lined up better. And apparently Walton would get very angry. And he would say, I don't need someone to tell me what I'm doing better. I need someone to tell me what they're doing better, that I'm missing. What am I missing that they see? Maybe something small, maybe something big. That's how we need to view the world. Talmud teaches us, I'm going to study it more next week in detail, but Talmud teaches us to start to look at the world not linearly, not rationally or irrationally, but non-rationally. It starts to look at the world macrocosmically and simultaneously microcosmically. Talmudic thinking teaches us to take source material, to extrapolate from it conclusions, to compare our conclusions with other people's conclusions. And in so doing, to start to really get a feel of the universe. As I said, when I was young, I thought us were old men who have too much time on their hands. Now I believe Talmud has the secrets to the universe, if only in the way that it teaches us to think. If only in that way alone. Talmud is what has kept us thinking in a certain way, in a very powerful way, in a very complete way. We don't look at just Western medicine as opposed to homeopathic medicine or as opposed to Eastern medicine and acupuncture. We look at how it all integrates together. We don't look at just, what medical drugs need to be used. We also look at what are the indigenous cultural herbs that have been used in ethnobotany. We don't look at just one piece or the other. We try to see multiple perspectives because God is infinite. And it's that journey. That's what Talmud is about. It's about the journey through law and through stories, through lore. It's about the journey that opens our minds and our hearts and our spirits and our souls to seeing and experiencing the world in a greater way. So while the books of Ketuvim, the last section of the Bible, teach us to experience God in different relationships, Talmud teaches us how to think and see and understand and integrate our experiences and our opponents' experiences in ways that are holy. We say Elu ve'elu. These words and these words are both words of Torah. It is because that, going back to the question about Reform and Orthodoxy, that one community worships this way and another community worships this way. It's not that this is right and this is wrong, although maybe. But we need to understand where people come from, where they get to, and is that argument okay? That's what we start to understand. Talmud starts to help us to experience and see the world in a much, much bigger way than just A to B to C to D. It teaches us to think in a non-rational, spiritual manner. And it is a huge gift as a result. So I think that's a good place to take a break. And next week, please print out this handout on Talmud. We're going to explore a lot of it. And we're going to look at some of these sages, Hillel and Shammai and Eliezer and Gamaliel. We're going to look at some Aggadic material and see how it teaches us law and behavior, how to modify behavior, how to have behavioral techniques. We're going to look at some qualities that are legal and also about these human beings. And in so doing, we can study and learn a little bit of Talmud. It is so important to understand Talmud, to understand anything with Judaism. You cannot understand where we are today without understanding this bridge of Talmud from which everything is then commented on. So we have Torah, Tanakh, our Bible, then Talmud, which is, again, Mishnah and Gemara, structurally, and Halakha and Agadah, thematically. Thank you for being good to me. Thank you for sharing this. I hope this is worthwhile. And B'ezrat Hashem, we will all see each other next week as we continue learning about Talmud, about studying together. Have a great week. Be gentle with each other and respect those you disagree with. Thanks.